On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And the disciples heard it. And they came to Jerusalem. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when they came, they went out of the city. And when evening came, he went out of the city. Now, as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed is withered." And Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that which he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also, who is in heaven, may forgive you your trespasses." Now may God add the blessing to the reading of his word. Now, as you see on the screen, here is a picture of a fig tree. Now, before this week, I didn't really know what a fig tree looked like, so now we're all on the same page. This is kind of what a fig tree looks like. So in all respects, when Jesus is coming up to this fig tree, all right, he sees leaves, it looks like it's alive and healthy, but it seems confusing as to why Jesus curses it, because it seems healthy, there's nothing wrong with it, and just because there's no fruit on there and it's not in season, like, all right, why is he doing that? It shouldn't have fruit right now. So why is Jesus, why is he cursing it? It doesn't really make sense. But when I did some research and learned a few things about fig trees, is that whenever there's leaves, there's typically fruit forming along with it. So in the case of this tree, there are leaves, but not fruit. Now, even though there's an appearance that there should be fruit starting to form, so there shouldn't be like nice ripe fruit yet at this time of year. But so Jesus is deceived, but there's nothing there. And the thing is, like, even unripened figs people are able to eat. So even if you see leaves, all right, there's going to be something for me to actually go up and eat. So if we kind of look to end of verse 13, it would be better to describe it as, it was not the time for ripe figs to appear, only unripened figs. And thus he finds nothing, which is a problem. And if we look to try to figure out what this fig tree example is for, we kind of see it as a visual of the leaders of the temple. And I'll return to this point a little bit later. Now, for many of you who grew up in the church, you may be familiar with the middle section of this passage. Jesus getting angry and clearing the temple, etc. So let's think here for a second. Why was Jesus angry at what's going on here? What was Jesus' motive in clearing the temple? Was it necessary to make a scene and do all this instead of just his normal teaching like we see all over in the Gospels? And I would say that Jesus has good reason for his actions. And I think the main one is God cares about our motives. God cares about our motives. Now let's think about what's happening in this time of year in the story. So this is the time of Passover, the biggest event on the Jewish calendar, where all Jewish people and converts from all over the known world come to Jerusalem to celebrate. Now there have been estimations about 250,000 people would come to the city to celebrate this, which tripled the actual population of Jerusalem at this time. So even though this may not seem like a lot of people in our eyes, I would say imagine it in a tight space, old city, like this is 2,000 years ago. I would say it's even in our days comparable to like Times Square on New Year's Eve. Maybe not that crazy, but on that similar scale. And even with this chaos in the city, you would expect the temple to be a more calm, serene place of worship, maybe a little bit of hustle and bustle. but it would be, like a place that we can go to be away from the craziness of the city. Like we would imagine, like, all right, either this youth building or even the sanctuary in the other building is like. Um, but when Jesus walks into the temple, he sees a place of commerce and thievery. Now, where all of this was taking place was in the court of the Gentiles. So, and this is the place where all people, Jew and Gentile alike, come in to worship God and make their sacrifices. Now, in Jesus' day, this was an area estimated 500 by 325 yards, which is about 35 acres of space. Ginormous. Now, when people entered this space, they would find that the court of the Gentiles was a virtual stock market of animal dealers and money changers, all of whom were necessary to ensure proper sacrifices and offerings for the many pilgrims in the temple. Now, this does not sound like a place of worship to me. But I'm sure at the beginning of all of this, what the reason for having all this going on was to make the lives of those coming from all over the place, pilgrims, people coming from all over to celebrate, just to make it easier for them. It became a massive business endeavor that profited the Sadducees and those ruling the temple. And the temple precincts were overseen, so the temple itself was overseen by the Sadducees. And the immense volume of trade and exchange in the court of Gentiles was crucial not only for the proper maintenance of proper worship, but also for the financial gain of the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin. Now we see here the importance of the motivation for the actions done in the temple. Now there's definitely a right and wrong way to be buying and selling these goods and exchanging money for people to pay the tax and do their sacrifices. Now Sadducees could have been setting up a way for the people to do it in a nice and easy way and fair for those to actually properly worship God like they're seeking to do, so that both pilgrims and the people of the temple would be happy. But somewhere along the way, this point got missed, and it became what Jesus saw in this passage. Instead of making an easy way for people to exchange and worship, it became an additional burden to the people there. And they were already ruled and heavily taxed by Rome, and the Sadducees were doing essentially the same thing to their own people, but just in the name of God and the temple. And that is why it's called a den of robbers. And I would say you could even compare it to like selling snacks and selling gear like we do downstairs. It could very easily be misused. And if Pastor Jacob and the youth staff were trying to make money off of you all and charge you guys really high amounts, like $5 for a candy bar, like they would be misusing it. But I know that their intention is to provide you all snacks and gear at affordable and low prices because the church just doesn't have the budget to give you guys for free. And they're trying to give you guys nice amenities and not make huge profits like we see the Sadducees are doing here in this passage. Now, these things are made to aid your worship experience and not take advantage of you in your presence here tonight. Now, an important lesson that Jesus reacts in this way is because the temple is God's physical presence in this day. So now Solomon originally made the temple to be God's physical place of residence on earth for all time. And if you look at 1 Kings 8, we see the cloud literally fills the house of God when it is finally being dedicated and fully made. But unfortunately, the temple we see here is actually the third temple that was built in Jerusalem because the previous two had been destroyed by Israel's enemies. But this is a place where God dwells at this time. If we look to John 2, Jesus is actually clearing the same temple, a year or two previous, and it's described that zeal for your house will consume me. Speaking of Jesus. Jesus is consumed with the protection of God's house, where God lives. Just like I'm sure your family is very protective over your house or your apartment or wherever you live. If you don't want people breaking in and stealing your stuff, you're going to protect it with everything that you have. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing with the temple, because it's essentially his house. But today, we don't have a physical temple. The church is not a direct correlation to the temple. But today, God dwells inside of believers, as stated in 1 Corinthians. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, whom you have from God? Revealing that the Holy Spirit within us as believers is the temple where God dwells today. Now we also see here that Jesus is for all people. All people. By Jesus clearing the court of the Gentiles, he is in turn making a way for Gentiles to worship. So now, there's the court of the Gentiles where only Gentiles could go. Within there, you have the court of the women and then the court for men. So Gentiles could only be on that larger outer court, but Jews could go inside and have their own space. But the space where the Gentiles are trying to worship is clogged with all this loud animals, people, money, going all this business going on, not a place of worship at all. So Jesus is trying to make a way for them to actually worship. And if we look to the Jewish people, they were looking for a Messiah who would come in high status and be like a military authority and throw out Rome and run the world that they lived in that day. They're hoping for a Messiah that would get rid of the Gentiles around them that was making their lives hard. Instead, Jesus is clearly doing the exact opposite. We see from other places in his ministry that he's trying to preach to all towns, not just one place. Early in his ministry, he says, I'm here to go to the next town and the next town. And we see that his desire is continued when he speaks to the Samaritan woman in John 4. And if we looked into Acts, Peter is literally given a vision for him to understand that the gospel is for all people, Jews and Gentiles. All are clean. And in our lives, just like these Jews, we can put God into a box, just like the Jews. It's easy for us to have a box that we put God in. It's like, all right, I like this part of God, so he's gonna go. He's good. He's nice. He's gonna answer my prayers. All right. When I'm in times of need, he's gonna be there. Yep, he's gonna give me exactly what I want. This is the box that I think God is in. But that's not Yahweh. That's not the God of the Bible. If anything, that's the God of our own making. Now, as the imagery of the fig tree closes, we see the result of Jesus' curse. The tree dies. Now, only does it die only after one day. It's noticeably dead all the way to the root. Now, if you look to the picture I have up here, it's kind of a good example of what it could kind of look like. And just imagine the nice, luscious tree I showed you earlier to this one. Now, this is what Jesus is saying the fruit of the temple leaders are. They are dead all the way to the root, where there's no chance of fruit coming from them again. And we know that God's judgment for these people will come as a result of their faith apart from God. Their faith was in themselves, their money, or the temple, all of which stay here on earth, and they will lose after they die. Now, as we turn to the end of the passage, we see that God does the impossible by producing fruit in fruitless people. Now here we see Jesus' response to the imagery that he's been shown through the fig tree. Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that when he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And wherever you stand, praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also, who is in heaven, may forgive you your trespasses. Now we need to be careful with this part of the passage. We can easily take it out of context and lean it towards the prosperity gospel. So, and if we read it too quickly, it could read something like, all right, you just need to have enough faith, and whatever you pray will be answered, and you'll be pretty much you have a free pass to heaven. But that's not really what it's saying. So the first statement is have enough faith. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, conviction of things not seen. And then if we think about why Mark is putting this passage here, it's denoting that Jesus is the object of faith, not the temple. Now, this is why prayer must be in Jesus' name and not anything else. Jesus is the only one who can save, and God is the God of the impossible. He can save us. Those who have rejected him and are dead to the root. He can produce fruit, the fruit of faith and the fruit of the Spirit within us. We know that God gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But he also James warns us that we must not suppose that we'll receive anything from the Lord because we are double-minded in all our ways. And he continues later saying, we do not have because we do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly, to spend it on your own passions. Now our prayers may not be answered, not because of our lack of faith in God to answer them, because we know God can answer them, but it's because we're asking wrongly. We're wanting our own selfish things for our own benefit, not for the benefit of God or for his people. But then that raises the question, all right, what about genuine prayers from righteous people that are asking for good things and are trying to ask for prayers of people who are actually in need and need God's help? This is where God's wisdom comes into play. God's purposes are genuinely unknown to us. We don't know exactly what's going on, why things happen, and why sickness and pain comes in the lives of those we love. And honestly, there are still some things that in my life where I don't really know why they happen. And I'm sure there's things in your life that you question, I don't know why this is happening. But I know and trust that God's thoughts are not my thoughts. Neither are God's ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are God's ways higher than my ways, and God's thoughts than my thoughts, as Isaiah tells us. If they were, I just might be calling myself God. Now, if you look back to the lives of the Sadducees and those ruling the temple, let's think about where their faith was placed in. It was in themselves, their money, or in the physical temple in which they worshiped. And as I've discussed, faith in all those things will fail us. They stay here on earth, just as it failed them, as demonstrated by the dead fig tree. Now, faith in God surpasses all of the things in this world and helps us to see the impossible, the salvation of all people, fruit produced in the fruitless, the dead, and God rearranging our motives. So as we go on from here, Calvary Youth, let us have faith in the God over everything else.